He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
Hey, it's Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia. Thanks for joining us. We've got a guest today that I think has a really, really important message for anybody who likes seeing. Phil, take it away.
Yeah, seeing is good. So we're really excited to have Dr. Chris Knnobe on today. Chris has a new book out, which I really think is the definitive, reference now on vegetable and seed oils. It's called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. And Chris's background is as a ophthalmologist and comes at this with a little bit of a unique perspective that I don't think we've really covered on this show before. So really excited to get into it. Chris, why don't you give our audience a little bit of your background and kind of the backstory as to how you got to this point?
Sure, Philip. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's good to see you, and I appreciate this opportunity. So, my background is, I'm a conventionally trained physician, like Dr. Ovadia, and I'm an ophthalmologist. I practiced for 24 years. But during a good part of that, I was suffering from arthritis that led me down a path of discovery, really. And I began to research nutrition in 2011 after just sort of a partial paleo diet. It improved my arthritis a whole lot. And that eventually led me to the work of Weston A. Price that I discovered in myself in 2013. And I eventually hypothesized that processed foods, which I then understood were driving most all of this chronic disease, everything from heart disease to cancer to stroke and diabetes and so on. And I hypothesized that the same processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, AMD, the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. Now, and so I began to investigate that for about a year and a half while I was still in practice. And I was so convinced that that hypothesis held water that by February of 2015, I left practice to pursue that full time. I was kind of towards the end of what I thought might be my career in ophthalmology so I investigated that with a small group, and we looked at data of, processed food consumption data tracked by sugar and vegetable oils in 25 nations. And the data supported that hypothesis in every single nation. That is that, as processed foods went up, as marked by sugar and vegetable oils, which are good proxy markers of processed foods, and they are processed foods in and of themselves, of course, that supported the hypothesis strongly. And so I published a paper on that along with our group and published a book. But eventually by about 2018, 2019, Philip, I was so convinced that the vegetable oils and high omega-6 diets were driving the bulk of this chronic disease that I went public with that in 2019 at the Ancestral Health Symposium, which was held at the University of California, San Diego that year, and kind of been on this trail ever since. So in this latest book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution, it's called, we've worked really hard to connect vegetable oils to virtually all chronic disease. So coronary heart disease, cancers, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, overweight, obesity, Alzheimer's, dementia, age-related macular degeneration, all of those and more, and the autoimmune diseases. It's sort of, as you know, I've basically gathered data to support the hypothesis, and that in the form of a lot of graphs, essentially. And so that's where I've been over the last few years.
Yeah, amazing work. And, I guess we'll get right into maybe one of the big questions because you brought it up already. I would have maybe built up to this, but, the correlation versus causation. And, we've discussed many times on this show how, that same sort of correlative data was used to vilify things like saturated fat, and how erroneous that is. And so you just mentioned kind of these correlations between vegetable oil consumption and these health outcomes, but how do we know that this is actually a causative and a real effect?
Well, I think it's, then there's a lot of perspectives to that, Philip. But so my perspective is different than a lot of physicians and perhaps a fair number of other researchers, in that first of all, we've not seen any randomized controlled clinical trials with diet that have ever properly controlled diet or controlled diets for very long. And as you know, most all the chronic diseases that we're so interested in, they have very, very long incubation periods. Obviously, you don't see heart attacks or coronary heart disease very often before age 40. We don't see age-related macular degeneration very often before age 40. Alzheimer's disease, even much older than that. Many of the cancers seem to hit in midlife, and really the longest that any studies have entirely controlled diet is about 6 months, and in very small numbers of people, because in order to completely control a diet, you have to put people into a metabolic ward. You have to prepare all of their food in a metabolic kitchen. You have to track everything they eat. They can't leave the metabolic ward. They have to be prisoners of the ward, because if they leave, they can go to McDonald's and have a hamburger and French fries and Coke, and the study is ruined. And so we have all these problems and all these studies that really haven't convincingly told us anything about diet. It's diet and most chronic disease, because they've never been properly done, and they never will be, because like I said, it's impossible to properly control diets in people. So I believe, just like Weston Price did in the 1930s, that as he observed people that transitioned from their native traditional diets to westernized diets, he saw what was happening to these people. They developed dental decay, arthritis, cancers, and all sorts of degenerative diseases, including birth defects and growth abnormalities. But he didn't do a randomized controlled clinical trial. Obviously, he observed what was happening in nature, essentially. And that's what I do primarily, because that's the best thing that we have. And we can track food consumption very accurately over the past 50 or 60 years in most of the world. And we have data that goes clear back to the mid-19th century and even earlier on food consumption in the United States. And so if you look at that in relation to the prevalence or even the incidence or both of all of these chronic diseases, that is powerful information. And I think it's by a landslide, phenomenally better than anything we have in randomized controlled trials. Now, some of the trials in diet trials in animals, they're very telling in terms of omega-6 consumption, seed oil consumption in animals versus those that do not get those.
We'll talk about that.
But we don't have. Well, I could give you one example. For example, I've got a graph right here. I have a few things around me that in case I need to pull up some data. But I'll give you an example. Like in one study, researchers put rodents, mice, I think it was, on multiple different kinds of diets. But the one let me just say I'll just mention 3 of those diets, okay? Because there was more than that. But in one of those, there was no seed oils whatsoever, and the rodents were raised on standard chow, and that was 1.2% omega-6 linoleic acid. So those mice, I think they grew to typical size, and we'll just call that an average of 170 pounds for a man. This is where they grew to. This would be appropriate for rodents. All right. So then they had another diet where they put the animals on 19% soybean oil diet. Now that's 10% omega-6 linoleic acid. Now, let me tell you, this is important because these animals were getting less seed oil than Americans do. We're getting about more than a fourth of our diet, around a fourth of our diet from seed oils. All right, but anyway, so they were getting less seed oils than Americans and less omega-6, but they became morbidly obese. They grew to a human equivalent of 261 pounds. And what's interesting about that one was that they gave them 25.9% fructose. So extreme high sugar. All right. So that's where they ended up 261 pounds. Now, a third group was given 19% soybean oil, the same amount, but no sugar at all. And they became they became the most morbidly obese. They grew to a human equivalent of 277 pounds. So they outweighed the mice on the soybean and sugar oil diet by a human equivalent of 16 pounds. And this was in 32 weeks. This is 8 months worth. All right. So interestingly, the sugar was actually protective, in this study. And
Wow.
this is what we've seen in a number of studies, that the sugar actually, may be a benefit over, the just these high seed oil diets alone. But there's, this is what I've seen.
Well, let me back up. There's not really a human analog to those two types of diets. Well, I should back up to the type of diet that's strictly seed oil. We're not getting.
I think we see it all. I think we see it all the time. But you can't separate out, at a population level who's consuming the higher sugars and who is not. But I think that almost all of the population in almost all westernized populations are consuming very high levels of seed oils and omega-6. So we've gone from,
but with the sugar, I think is what Jack was getting.
Yeah,
at.
that was my point.
It's hard to consume seed oils without sugar in our modern food environment. Although, as you point out in the book, we can find different populations where that experiment was sort of run, that the seed oil was introduced maybe without the sugar components.
Yeah, you see some of those, for example, I'll give you an example, like in China. This is in the book too. In China, the sugar consumption is among the lowest in the world. I think they're the eighth lowest sugar consumption in the world. And we've got excellent data. All the data since 1961 comes from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO. And so, all researchers basically use that kind of data. But anyway, so the sugar consumption in China was only around 20 some calories a day back in 1961, never elevated above around 80 calories per day. In the last 4 decades, it's been only about 2.5% of their total food consumption, 2.5%. So again, 8th lowest in the world, but their vegetable oil consumption started off at 30 calories a day back in 1961 and ended up by 2018 at 204 calories per day, which was, I can't remember exact percentage of their diet that is, sorry. But nevertheless, here's what happened to them during this period. So their cancer during this period increased 3.2-fold between 1990 and 2017. Diabetes increased from 3.7% to 6.7%. So it increased 78%, approximately doubled, right? Overweight and obesity combined increased from 15.3% in 1991 to 42% in 2015. So it almost tripled, right? Their overweight and obesity. They had a 465% increase in lung cancer while the smoking went down. So these are the kind of things that I see, around the world. For example, in the United States, since 1999 or 2004, sugar's been going down, while obesity and diabetes have taken a much steeper ascent, right? In Australia, since 1961, sugars and carbohydrates have been going down, while obesity and diabetes go through the roof. In the United Kingdom, sugar's been going down since 1961, while their obesity, I gave you exact numbers, but their obesity and diabetes has gone way, way up, right? Similar situation in Israel and in Japan. The data is striking, and we could go through that if you want me to. But
Oh yeah,
so when you
Japan's
see,
always a good population study because it's a very homogeneous population, and they're geographically isolated.
which one?
Japan.
Yeah.
Tell us. I want to hear about Japan.
Yeah. Okay. So in Japan, we have excellent data on Japan, on their food consumption. And, we know, first of all, that the Japanese have been eating a diet that is very rich in carbohydrates, for centuries. We know that, they, as some have said, they've lived off of, white rice and fish for thousands of years. And then the Okinawans, again, a subset of the Japanese, their diet for several hundred years, 300 to 400 years that we know of, was primarily sweet potatoes, with pork and vegetables. All right. So again, mainland Japan, mostly white rice, fish and vegetables, and Okinawans, mostly sweet potatoes, pork, and vegetables. All right. So in 1960, their total calories was 2,837, and that declined to about 1,950 calories by around 2004.
Wait, the average Japanese was consuming 2,800 calories a day.
These are not corrected for losses. So that's total food consumption availability. Okay. That's what most of the data is presented as, is total food consumption availability, because there's always some food losses, and nobody knows exactly how to track that. All right. So their carbohydrate percentage was in 1961, 84%. By 2004, that had dropped to 56%. Their saturated fat, the lowest in the developed world, at 7% recently. And their sugar consumption, was 198 calories in 1961. It peaked at 329 calories per day in 1989, and then started going down, ended up at 283 calories by 2004. Okay, so we've got recently total calories going down, carbohydrates going down, sugar going down since 1989. But here's the one thing that went up: seed oils. So their seed oils were 9 grams a day in 1961. That increased to 39 grams a day by 2004. So it increased 4.5-fold. And that made their omega-6 increase from 1% in 1961 to 7.8% in 2004. Here's what happened to them during this period. Obesity in the men doubled. It increased from 16% in 1978 to 31.2% in 2010. Breast cancer increased 5-fold, or approximately 5-fold, between 1975 and 1999. Diabetes increased 345-fold between 1954 and 2007. They went from 0.02% in 1954 of the population to 6.9% in 2007. All right. Their macular degeneration increased from 0.2% in the mid to late 1970s to 16.37% in 2013. That's an 82-fold increase. Okay. So again, well, the calories went down, the carbohydrates went down, the sugar went down, and did I say it? The calories went down, their omega-6 went up, And they're obesity, diabetes, macular degeneration, cancer, right? All through the roof, right? What else? What are you going to blame it on? It's the one thing that's going up is their seed oil consumption and their omega-6 consumption.
So do we know the mechanism, or at least do we have a theory about the mechanism?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Yeah. That's it's a long theory, but I mean, I think there's many pathways to get to these diseases, but ultimately the seed oils and the high omega-6 is ultimately pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, directly toxic, and nutrient deficient. And you put those I call those the 4 pillars of hazard together, and you've got the recipe for all of this disaster. But it's basically
List those again.
Pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, directly toxic, cellularly toxic, and nutrient deficient. So we could talk about those a little bit, but I don't know if we really, if you want to take the time, but it's up to you.
And well, I think we will unpack that a little bit, but just to stay at a high level for a moment, your hypothesis, which again, I think there's lots of evidence for. I do want to point out in the book, you have over 1,300 references, I believe. So very well referenced. But your hypothesis is that it's the linoleic acid, omega-6s in particular, that are harmful within these oils.
Right, absolutely, Philip. That's exactly it. So the omega-6 consumption, we modeled this, the American diet, for example, in 1865, before there was any seed oils, and when all of the food would have been naturally raised, ancestrally raised. We didn't have we had no seed oils, but we also didn't have any corn and soy fed animals, and we didn't have nuts and seeds in huge quantities like we do now, which are all things that add tremendously to the omega-6 load. But anyway, so the diet was provided about 2.2 to 2.6 grams of omega-6 linoleic acid in 1865. That was about 1.1% of total calories. So that, without giving you the numbers in between, by 2008, we were consuming 29 grams of omega-6 linoleic acid on average per day. That's 11.8% of calories. So whether you look at it in terms of the percentage of increase in omega-6 or the mass of omega-6, either one comes out to be about 11-fold increase in omega-6 consumption between 1865 and 2008. And that, to me, everything I see this, fits with this. Like, for example, I've looked at, multiple hunter-gatherer populations, the Maasai, the Tokelauans, the Catawbans, the Papua New Guineans of Tucacenta, the Ashe of Paraguay, and there's others. And all of these, what I found was that in analyzing their diets, that their omega-6 consumption is all basically under 2%. Most of them are under 1.7%. So those that have really high fat consumption, like the Maasai, who consume milk, meat, and blood, and their diet is 66% animal fat and 40 to 46% saturated animal fat, their diet was only 1.7% omega-6 linoleic acid. Where are Americans? Well, as I mentioned, we're at 11.8% now. And, in 1999, we were at 7.8%, I believe it was. So we've had this trend, where it's just been increasing since around 1900 as really since 1866, when vegetable oils entered the food supply, and the omega-6 has just been climbing ever since. And with that, we just see an explosion of all this chronic disease that was rare in the 19th century.
Yeah, and again, the omega-6 content is, one of the differentiators. What people will sometimes get confused about is, things like olive oil and coconut oil that have been shown to be, health promoting.
Right.
And they say, well, isn't that a vegetable oil? And that omega-6 content, as well as the process that goes into making it, is what distinguishes that from those oils from the seed oils that we're talking about.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so there, when you start talking about vegetable oils, you've got to get into the nuance, because it's critical to understand that. But the seed oils, as you just said, Philip, they're high omega-6 linoleic acid. They range from approximately the low in canola oil, which is around 20% omega-6 linoleic acid, to soybean oil that's 54 to 56% omega-6 linoleic acid, and then safflower oil at the highest at 78%. But if you contrast that to naturally raised animals, cattle, pigs and chickens, their omega-6 linoleic acid on their proper diet will not be over about 2.5% of their fat. So that's what we should be getting, is that, and that's what the whole world consumed, was almost everywhere they didn't have any olive oil, they were consuming animal fats, and that is butter, lard, and beef tallow, and all of those would be no more than maybe 2.5 to 2 to 3.5% omega-6 linoleic acid. And again, contrast that to the seed oils, which would be, I'll just name them: soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, and peanut oils. All of those range from about 20% to 78% omega-6 linoleic acid. And they average if you look at population-wide studies, they average about 38 to 40% omega-6 linoleic acid. That's what's in those vegetable oils sort of worldwide, and again, that's the massive change in our omega-6 consumption, or accounts for that.
So just to, dig in a little bit more there, again, how do we separate the vegetable and seed oils from the processed food? So some might make the argument that, and you even said it yourself earlier, that, vegetable and seed oil consumption is really a proxy for processed food consumption. And,
right.
Many would just say, well, it's the processed food. And let's say you just use these oils, to cook your vegetables in or cook your meat in, is that going to be as bad?
Well, I guess, first of all, Philip, I'd just say that, number one, processed foods, which I've always vilified, they, to me, are four things. They're refined flours, refined sugars, vegetable oils, and trans fat. So to say, can we separate out vegetable oils from processed food? I think, well, not really, because they are processed food. I mean, they're the number one ingredient of processed foods on a caloric basis, pretty much worldwide, to my knowledge. Certainly the number one ingredient in processed food in the United States, with 32% of our calories coming from vegetable oil in 2010. Again, and that's not corrected for losses. So it'd be a little bit lower than that on average. Like I said, it's maybe around a fourth of our diet, but possibly, up to a third. But nevertheless, is there, could you just, consume these vegetable oils in a healthy way, just by cooking with them at home and avoiding the processed foods? It certainly would be, it'd be better. It definitely would be better, because the heating process of the oils it adds to their danger, because when you heat these oils, you create the advanced lipid oxidation end products. These are things like 4-hydroxynonenal, malondialdehyde, MDA, carboxyethylpyrrole, acrolein, and there's literally hundreds of others of these chemicals that the lipid chemists understand. And so when you heat the oils, you're going to produce more of those, so you'll consume more of those. And those are all dangerous. They're collectively, those advanced lipid oxidation end products, or ALs, they're collectively cytotoxic, genotoxic, mutagenic, carcinogenic, atherogenic, thrombogenic, obesogenic, and diabetogenic. So, you can't get much worse than that. So they contribute to all of those problems, but that's just part of the scenario. And what I tell people, and what we clearly understand, is that even if you don't have those advanced lipid oxidation end products in the oil when you consume them, you can produce all of those endogenously, because when you consume omega-6, it accumulates in your body fat. And then when those oxidize, you'll produce all of those same chemicals.
So just make sure I understand what you just said.
Sure.
Even if you're not getting the incredibly toxic list that you just described, if you're consuming the seed oils themselves, once they're in your body, they do their work and create those toxic reactions anyway.
They do.
I realize that's grossly simplified, but
no, that's exactly right.
Not everybody
do, because they oxidize, and you can't stop the oxidation. In other words, it's the omega-6 linoleic acid, which is an unsaturated fat, those are the most subject to oxidation because of the multiple double bonds. So when these accumulate in your body and in your body fat, which they do to very high levels, then you're a setup for these processes, for the oxidation, and then the inflammation and the toxicity and all that. And so that's what I'm talking about. You can't avoid that just because you didn't heat the oil or cook with it.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, because I've actually heard a number of people in the space making the argument that the oils, the omega-6 itself is not the issue. It's only when it gets oxidized that is problematic. But as you said, once it's in you, there's no way to prevent it from getting oxidized.
That's right. It's going to oxidize. Yeah. And there's no way to consume higher levels of these and not accumulate these in your body fat. That's what they do. Our body for whatever reasons, we accumulate these, any kinds of the fatty acids, and they are reflected on a percentage basis based on what you've been consuming over the past approximately 3 years. So, for example, we see in ancestrally living populations, there's 4 or really 5 of these studies that have been done. Back in 1969, a group, researcher Ian Pryor and colleagues, they studied several populations and looked at their body fat omega-6 linoleic acid, and it averaged 2.83%. Well, Americans averaged 9.1% omega-6 linoleic acid in 1959 in their body fat, and they averaged 21.5% in their body fat in 2008. So again, and it's a precise parallel.
In 50 years, we more than doubled it?
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. And what did we more than double our seed oil consumption? You bet we did. In 1961, we were consuming 19.5 grams of vegetable oil on average per day. 2010, 80 grams per day. So again, everywhere you look, you see that as the vegetable oil consumption goes up, the omega-6 LA consumption, linoleic acid in the food goes up, and your body fat omega-6 LA goes up precisely in correlation with that. And as I keep showing, that they'll overweight, obesity goes up, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, all coronary heart disease, all of these diseases go through the roof in parallel with this.
Okay, you've convinced me of the bad news. Do we have any course of action can we turn the Titanic around and maybe not hit the iceberg?
I think so. Absolutely. So the bad news, the further bad news
Oh, thanks.
is that it takes the half-life of any fatty acid in your body fat is 600 to 680 days. Just let's round that off to about 2 years. One study showed that you can completely replace all of your fatty acids in your body in 3 years. So that's better than what I expected it to be. So it's 3 years. So you can turn the Titanic around, but it might take you 3 years to do it. If you go from, let's say you're the typical American, you're getting a fourth of your food, and I use the term loosely, from vegetable oils, and you go to zero, and you get, you also eliminate the high omega-6 fats coming from CAFO, corn and soy-fed chicken and pork, and you eliminate nuts and seeds. So now you're at an ancestral level of omega-6 consumption. If you do that for 3 years, you're going to bring your body fat down from, let's say, typical American 21.5% down to where it should be, which is under probably 3%. You can do that in 3 years. And I think you turn the tide on all of these conditions, but it's going to take you a while. And the only thing I know to do is get the seed oils, get the vegetable oils, and these other things, these other methods. You have to implement those, and everything else you can do that's healthy in the meantime to support yourself. And probably exercise will help to burn those. But yes, you'll turn the tide, and then you will drastically reduce your risk of all of these, of overweight and all these chronic diseases. And many people, they stop vegetable oils, and literally in 6 or 8 weeks, they're seeing tremendous health benefits and weight loss.
Do you are you a fan of testing omega-6 levels? And there are a number of ways to do that these days. You can do it in the blood, you can do it in the red blood cells, finger stick, home test. What are your thoughts on testing these levels?
Yeah, well, I wish that we could that we could do what they've done in the studies routinely, which is to do an adipose biopsy. So biopsy the body fat, which is done with a tiny needle, like a 16 gauge needle, Philip, and you do it out in the buttocks or in the abdomen, and just get a little tiny sample of fat, and you can have that analyzed. But that's not done routinely anywhere. It's only been done in studies. But that would be by far and away the gold standard test. And as far as all the other tests that look at the fatty acids in the blood, there's been some good correlation with some of them and not so good in others. And I just have not seen enough evidence yet to make me believe that the blood studies of the fatty acids are all that, or that they're the best. They're an excellent thing to do. I just don't know that they really are. Not saying they're not, but I haven't seen enough evidence to prove it one way or another. I've seen that a couple of them had pretty good correlation to the adipose fatty acids, but there's just not enough evidence there to convince me that would be the way to go.
Is there anything?
Oh, go ahead, Jack.
A couple of related questions. One, so you've got this buildup of linoleic acid in your body fat. Its half-life is 2 years. Is there anything that can be done to neutralize this linoleic acid when it's in your system while you are gradually getting rid of it?
Not to neutralize it, Jack, but you can further protect yourself while you're bringing your omega-6 in your body fat down by consuming a nutrient-dense diet. Of course, that's always protective. So I would say, a diet that especially is rich in any antioxidants, but like higher vitamin E consumption, and perhaps any antioxidants coming from plants that could be beneficial. All of those will help to protect you while you're bringing your omega-6 down in your body fat.
For those of us who don't actually track that stuff, give us some examples of those foods.
You mean that are high in vitamin E?
Yeah, antioxidants,
Yeah, well,
high in vitamin E.
yeah, so I would say, animal sources would be excellent for that. I'm trying to give you examples that I would recommend consuming too.
Sure.
I would say animal sources would be excellent for that. It could be animal meats, organ meats, eggs, milk, whole milk, whole raw milk. All of those would be good sources. So,
in other words, the stuff that Phil says we should eat all the time.
Yeah, anything that gives would give you good antioxidants that would generally be considered healthy. So if you can get those from plant sources, those would be potentially beneficial too.
It just it's what continues to be interesting to me is how many different perspectives you can come at this from and end up in the same place, which is, eat real food and
yes.
mostly animal foods, and you end up at the same place. Let's dig into, you're certainly the first ophthalmologist we've had on the program. And I know you really, kind of came at this because of macular degeneration. And I think that's something that people don't know a lot about. So I think this would be a great opportunity to talk a little bit about what that is, how it affects us, and then, kind of circle back to why this approach to combating it is going to be better than the mainstream approach, we'll say, for this disease.
Sure. Yeah. So age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, is, as I think I mentioned early on, is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And this is sort of where I entered this field of nutrition, is with macular degeneration, because back in 2013, when I had first learned that processed foods are driving all of this chronic disease, and I theorized or hypothesized that processed foods might be driving macular degeneration. As I mentioned, we investigated that in 25 nations, and the results supported the hypothesis. Well, so the macula is the central retina, counts for about the central 10 degrees of vision. And, the macula can only be seen by an ophthalmologist or optometrist or whoever with an ophthalmoscope or a slit lamp or whatever, to look back there. So when I first hypothesized this, Philip, back in 2013, the first thing I needed to know is when could ophthalmologists actually even see the retina, in order to diagnose it? Because I knew that if macular degeneration is a disease driven by processed foods, then there had to be a time when it was exceedingly rare or didn't exist. And so I went back and began investigating this. Well, and I didn't know any of this. We're not taught any of this in medical school, as you know. You don't know anything about the history of even your own specialty. Well, so macular degeneration, the macula could first be seen, visualized in the living eye in 1851, because Hermann von Helmholtz had designed the ophthalmoscope so that physicians, ophthalmologists could start looking into the back of the eye. And this technology spread around the world within a decade. And by 1880, for example, there were 86 different brands, types of ophthalmoscopes in use. And by 1900, I think it was over 200. But anyway, in the first 80 years of potential discovery, and these ophthalmologists, they're looking, they're documenting, they're photographing, they're drawing pictures. in first 80 years of potential discovery, between 1851 and about 1930, there was no more than about 50 cases of macular degeneration in the entire world. And this is documented, and there's extraordinary evidence that they're finding all these other retinal diseases, but not macular degeneration. And then macular degeneration just began to really be noticed in the 1930s, especially in the United States and in Europe. And then by the 1970s, we're at epidemic proportions. By 2020, there's 196 million cases in the world, and it's estimated there will be at 288 million by 2040. And so, but anyway, so this disease, it robs a person of their central vision. The vision that we use to see somebody's face or a stop sign or read a book, all those kind of things is your central, 5-10 degrees of vision. And that part of the eye degenerates. And so you have degeneration of a layer called the retinal pigment epithelium, which supports the photoreceptors, the rods and cones. And what you see in there is you see atrophy of the retinal pigment epithelium, which causes the rods and cones to atrophy or die. And you also see loss of the vasculature, the choriocapillaris, the layer beneath the retina that supplies blood to the retina. And it's much more complicated than just this, but those are some of the major things that we see in the back of the eye when we look there. And so with that, people have, when they develop this disease, they generally have a progressive loss of vision, which generally they don't notice anything for the first number of years. And they have precious little vision loss. And hopefully it's during that stage that they're diagnosed, and what I would recommend changing their diet, because there's been almost no benefit whatsoever with the standard treatment, which is, for dry macular degeneration, which has been Arid's formula vitamins. Has been, has almost no benefit at all. So anyway, I started, I went public with this theory and this evidence and this and the research in 2016. We published a paper on this in 2017. I published a book, and we've had people following this, and they went from their westernized diet to an ancestral diet in 2016. So we have a lot of people that have been doing this now for 6 or 7 years, hundreds of people that report to me. And virtually almost every single one of those has stabilized in terms of their vision loss and their progression of macular degeneration when they follow the diet. And they'll tell you if they're following it or not. So we've got good anecdotal evidence, but we don't, again, this, there are no formal studies being done on people yet.
So again, I apologize for asking the question, but any speculation as to the mechanism? What's going on that's doing this to the eye?
Well, is
it oxidation? Is it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all of these things. So it's a combination of it's a combination of oxidation, inflammation, toxicity, and nutrient deficiency, just like everywhere else in the body. And so you have damage to the retinal pigment epithelium that comes from all of those things. You have thickening of Bruch's membrane, which is a membrane that sits between the retinal pigment epithelium and the photoreceptors, the rods and cones. And that Bruch's membrane thickens and behaves exactly like an atherosclerotic plaque. So it's doing almost the same thing that what you see in the heart, in a coronary artery with the disease. It's thickening and it's creating a barrier between the blood supply, the choriocapillaris, and the retina proper. And so this is feeding this entire mechanism. Then you have when you're substituting vegetable oils for animal fats, you have loss of vitamins A, D, and K2, right? And so this is another mechanism. So you actually have nutrient deficiency as well on top of all this. But that's the really dumbed down version, what I'm trying to tell you here, because this is an incredibly complex disease, and there's a lot of a lot of arrows, a lot of things going, all conspiring together to create this disease. But the bottom line is it is a degenerative disease, just as its name implies, and it's driven by the toxicity and the nutrient deficiency of processed foods.
So I think we've identified the what, the when. We've talked briefly about the how. We've talked about some ways to at least arrest the process, if not reverse it, depending upon how it's presenting in your body. I realize this is not an area of research, but you probably know as much about it as anybody we've had on. Let's talk about the who. What the hell's going on here? Why is this being allowed to happen? There's always a reason this stuff happens. Speculate for us, if you don't mind.
What do you mean the who? And I'm not following your question really, Jack.
If I think what Jack's getting at is if this, and you've laid it out so well in the book, but if it's so obvious that these are causing these issues, how did this stuff get into our food supply to start with, and why does it persist in our food supply now?
Exactly.
You're saying the vegetable oils?
The vegetable oil, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, good question. So this goes back to when the first vegetable oil was introduced in the United States, really, and that was cottonseed oil, which entered the food supply right after the end of the American Civil War, ending in 1865. And the manufacturers had produced cottonseed oil. So Americans had never heard of or seen any kind of oil before, with essentially the exception of olive oil, which was an incredibly small amount up through the American Civil War. And so the manufacturers of cottonseed oil, which had been used as a lamp oil and machine oil, and then fertilizer, and then cattle feed, they figured out that they could feed it to cattle and the cattle didn't die. So they wanted to make profit. That's what the whole goal is: profit. It's always profit. And so they decided to try to sell it for human consumption. But Americans weren't buying. It didn't make any sense to them to use a machine oil or a lamp oil for food, right? And so
Shocking.
because that's the case. If you would have said the term vegetable oil in 1865 or 1866, nobody would have anywhere on the planet would have known what you're talking about, because the term didn't exist. It came about in the early 20th century. But anyway, so they couldn't sell it to people to use as food. So they first began to adulterate. They created margarine. And that's a mixture of butter and an oil, like cottonseed oil. And then they began to adulterate olive oil with it and sell it. Because again, people were buying olive oil. They weren't buying cottonseed oil. So they mixed it together and sold it. And there was complaint that came out of France in 1880, because we'd sent over, I think, hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil, and they knew it wasn't olive oil. It was adulterated olive oil, and they knew that just by tasting it. And then so then Procter & Gamble in the early 1900s, they began experimenting with cottonseed oil, and they worked with German chemist E.C. Kaiser, who helped them to partially hydrogenate the oil to produce what looked like lard, and that was Crisco. And so Crisco contains the partially hydrogenated oil, which is trans fat, right? And so these are the things. This is how they got it into the food supply. They margarine, they adulteration, and then Crisco, and then it just gradually grew, and all of the other vegetable oils then came into use. Once they were making so much money out of these other oils, cottonseed oil, and then soybean oil in 1909. And then we got all the others: corn, canola, cottonseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, right? All those, and gradually increased, and people gradually got sick while they told us that they're healthy, right? And then, by the 1950s and 1960s, then this is when the American Heart Association,
Ansel Keys comes along.
yes, exactly. That's it. Then we go into that story, which I won't go into. That's why I was pausing. I don't know if we need to even go there, but Ansel Keys, American Heart Association, all, figure out that vegetable oils make the cholesterol go down. And indeed they do. And so for that reason alone, that's the only reason they've really ever had, as far as I can tell, to recommend vegetable oils. And this is how they get away with it still today is total cholesterol does go down when you substitute vegetable oils for saturated animal fat, right, Philip? And with that alone, that's still the argument that they're using today to tell us to consume these. So you've got all of the major organizations. You've got Harvard, Tufts, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, American Heart Association. They're all telling us the same thing: consume these vegetable oils. They're healthy. They make your cholesterol go down, and they're good for your heart, right? And they're good, and they're good for you. And so this is how they continue to get away with this. But they're not going to get away with it forever. I mean, because more and more and more people are you see it everywhere, are beginning to understand this story and the fact that we've been fed a lie for 60 years. The people wise up to this.
So along those lines, then, what are your thoughts about some of the recent efforts to maybe create a better vegetable and seed oil? So a low linoleic acid, manufactured oil.
Yeah, well, I don't really know why we should do that, Philip. It doesn't make any sense to me that we should ever go down that path. Because I think it would be another experiment. I think it would just be kind of like going back to, Crisco, or when we first introduced cottonseed oil. It's an experiment on the people, and we don't have any reason to do that when we have good, healthy animal fats. We still have lard, butter, and beef tallow especially when they're all properly raised. That would be very, very, very healthy. And if everybody just substituted butter for their vegetable oils, and if they just got the vegetable oils out of their diet, I think we'd solve 80 to 90% of our chronic disease with that, when one fell swoop. That's all we'd have to do.
There's our pull quote right there.
Exactly.
Wow.
Well, that's my belief. I may be biased, but this is what I've been investigating for a decade, so I may be biased, but everything I see still leads me to this conclusion.
Well, I haven't studied it, but I began observing in the early 80s. It just seemed like people started getting slowly fatter.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the early 80s is also about the time that high fructose corn syrup took over from sugar as the preferred sweetener in manufactured foods. And as I've pondered it over the years, it seemed to me that many of the things that we vilified, it just didn't stand up to observational evidence. But the one thing that's been a constant in the increase in just general ill health has been the introduction of what I think of as just artificial food things. For the last 40 years, I've seen it over and over and over and over and over. So yeah, I wish you'd find something happy to tell me to end this year, because frankly, I'm a little depressed.
Well, I don't think you should be. We've got, when you know the cause, then you know what to do about it, right? And that's the brilliant of and it's so simple. I mean, there's a very simple answer. Number one is just get rid of processed foods. That's, refined flours, sugars, and vegetable oils. That just basically all you need to do is try to eliminate those, or just eliminate those. And now you're 90% of the way there for most people. And probably, you've solved most all of your risk for these chronic diseases. So I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's bright, and the potential is great to reverse all of this, but you have to understand what it is. And by the way, Jack, you're right. We've seen a huge explosion of obesity since 1980, and this is a lot of researchers or authors, they pin this on the fact that we were told to go low fat in 1980. Our dietary guidelines told us that, and that's what we did. We followed what we were told to do. We did drop our fat down from something like 41% to 33% over the next decade. And we got a lot more obese and sick and diabetic and all that. But the thing that kept going up was the vegetable oils. So while our fat consumption went down, we were replacing more of our animal fat with vegetable oils. That's exactly what we did. And that's what we continue to do through at least the most recent data proves that that's the case.
All right. So get rid of the processed foods, eat whole real foods. Phil, I feel like we've heard this somewhere.
I think we've said it. We've heard it once or twice, certainly. And like I said, you can come at it from all the different angles we've heard about. We've heard from so many different, medical specialties now on this show, and it's amazing how it all leads back to the same place.
It does. It absolutely does. Whether you're talking heart health or brain health or eye health or, stopping, preventing cancer and reversing obesity, it all comes back to the same answer. And it's, getting rid of the processed foods. And to me, that's the beauty of this is in the simplicity of it. I'm not saying it's not easy to do. And I think it's hard to navigate our food supply today because it's so complex. But if with a few fundamental principles, I think you can make a massive headway very easily, and you can do it today. For those who are on a standard American diet, they can begin today. They can stop the vegetable oil consumption today. That's a massive step right there.
Very good.
Excellent. Well, again, the book is widely available now, The Ancestral Diet Revolution. Where else can people find you and connect with you, Chris?
So we have two foundations, the Ancestral Health Foundation and Cure AMD Foundation. You can find those online. Well, the Ancestral Health Foundation, that website's not quite available yet, but will be very soon. We do have Facebook pages, Twitter pages for those, and Instagram for those foundations. And people could find me with a lot of YouTube videos, presentations and podcasts. Anyway, but Philip and Jack, I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I appreciate being able to be on your show.
Well, we appreciate your work, both the research and the publication. And if we haven't made the point yet, well, by golly, we'll just keep working at it. Dr. Chris Knnobe, that's Knobbe for our listeners. The contact information will be in the show notes. Go ahead and press that subscribe button so you get updated every time we get a new show out. They drop every Tuesday. And I think we're done today, Phil.
Thank you, Jack.
All right. We'll talk to you all later.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Philip.
America is fat and sick and tired. 88% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy and at risk of a sudden heart attack. Are you one of them? Go to ifixhearts.co and take Dr. Ovadia's metabolic health quiz. Learn specific steps you can take to reclaim your health, reduce your risk of heart attack, and stay off Dr. Ovadia's operating table.